So, everyone good? Okay, I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee on the National Broadband Network. Before calling the first witnesses, I ask a committee member to move that the media be allowed to film the proceedings today in accordance with the rules set down for committees, which include not taking footage or still images of members' papers or laptop screens.
I'll move that, Chair.
Thank you. And also, if someone could move that the committee authorises for publication and to be included in records of evidence the submissions and exhibits received up until today, which have been circulated and detailed, of which will be recorded in the minutes. Thanks, Ed Husick. This public hearing is part of the fourth six-monthly review of the rollout of the National Broadband Network. In its hearing today, the committee wishes to particularly focus on Telstra workforce issues associated with the NBN rollout. The committee started to look at these issues in its public hearing in Sydney on the 16th of April and made a number of comments and recommendations in the report tabled yesterday in Parliament. Specifically, the committee recommended that 1, the government report annually on progress under the retraining deed, and 2, an effort be made to communicate any emerging retraining needs and workforce demand. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and would now like to call the first witnesses from the Communications Division of the Communications, Electrical and Plumbing Union. So I now welcome the witnesses to the table for the Hansard record. Could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name's Dan Dwyer and I appear for the Communication Workers Union. I'm the Secretary of the Union.
And I'm Ros Eason and I'm the Research Officer at the national level.
Okay, thanks both for coming in this evening. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
Yes, Chair.
Feel free.
I've prepared a short statement. We've also made a submission which should be before you. Firstly, just thank you for the opportunity to address you today. The future of the work in the telecommunications industry is obviously of great interest to us, and we've been through this on many occasions over the last 20 or 30 years. We're one of the first unions, as you're probably aware, in the world to achieve safeguards in relation to the impacts of technological change. These were back quite a number of years ago. They were inserted into our awards, but unfortunately those safeguards have been stripped away in the course of various award modernisation processes. In the 1990s, we negotiated the best redundancy, or one of the best redundancy agreements in response to the impacts of industry deregulation. And fortunately, that agreement still stands, though we've had at times to defend it. We now face more structural change with the NBN. The NBN, of course, has potential to displace a significant number of people who are currently Telecom or Telstra employees, and will certainly affect the majority of our membership. Our membership is concentrated in the technical grades and in particular in the customer field workforce. So the government commitment of $100 million to Telstra for the retraining of those who might otherwise be made redundant by the NBN project is particularly welcome. We welcome the terms of the grant, which effectively recognise the CWU and other Telstra unions as stakeholders and require Telstra to consult with us on implementation. We've prepared a submission outlining our involvement with Telstra. A further quarterly meeting between Telstra and CWU was held last week on the 20th of June, and we can update the committee on that meeting. In summary, we're satisfied with the general direction and the pace of the program to date. We understand the program to be broadly synchronised with the NBN rollout itself and to be focused on work within the customer premises, an area where we believe there will be work opportunities for our members well into the future. Nevertheless, it is our view that successful implementation of the program does not exhaust the issues facing Telstra employees or the wider industry workforce in relation to NBN. As indicated in our submission, there are a number of questions surrounding the possible transition of Telstra employees into the NBN workforce. Should they in fact be made redundant, and how this transition might be facilitated. The issues here are funding of 1, recognition of prior learning, and 2, bridging training needed to meet NBN competency requirements. There's also a question of funding First, for those in the industry who have long left or who never worked for Telstra, many of whom are now subcontractors. And secondly, for new entrants who will not, for instance, qualify for funding under the National Workforce Development Plan. There's a lot of work being done in the industry around these issues, first by the NBN itself, in conjunction with the principal contractors and the registered training organisations, secondly by the National Skills Council, Innovation and Business Skills Australia, IBSA, by the State Industry Training Advisory Boards, the ITABs, and by the training brokers such as the Communication Information Technology Training, CITT. But bringing these pieces together has been a slow process. CW sees the need to ensure that these activities are sufficiently well funded and coordinated to ensure a timely supply of skills to the project. At present, there does not appear to us to be one body which has responsibility for the resources for developing an overall workforce strategy in this area and ensuring its implementation. This is a matter which we consider warrants the committee's and the government's further attention. We're happy to answer any questions you may have, and thank you for that opportunity.
All right, we've got half an hour of questions. 4 members. I might throw to the Deputy Chair first and then work our way around.
Dan, I'm interested in the workforce shortages and the recognition of prior learning.
Yes.
Who's doing that sort of training, and is it mainly just the techies and the lineys that will be getting that sort of work, or with the new fibre, ribbon fibres and opportunities, what can be done with partnerships with schools or vocational education to help with that sort of skill shortage?
Well, perhaps I could ask my associate, Ros Eason, if she could address that, then I may add something to it.
Well, recognition of prior learning can be an expensive exercise, so maybe if we just start with the question of the possible pool of people who may come out of Telstra, let's assume that a large number of people are in fact successfully retrained and redeployed, but that some may not be. And we can perhaps discuss that in terms of how that's retraining is happening. Those people will potentially nevertheless be able to work in sections of the NBN project on the rollout, but they may not sort of meet the criteria for funding under the National Workforce Development Fund to get the skill sets that NBN Co has now sort of said that they would require. Now, RPL is part of the solution to that, but who pays for it is the key question as far as we're concerned. Does Telstra pay for it as they come out of the workforce? I mean, I'm not sure that that's actually covered by the terms of the trust deed. Do the individuals pay for it? That's possibly a problem in terms of actually it happening. Or is it part of a larger, government funding out of, say, the National Workforce Development Fund, which is a possibility, but I'm not sure that it's sort of been crystallised as a strategy, if you like, at this point. There are people working on that question about how you get the bridging training funded for people coming out of Telstra in particular. But RPLing as a standalone exercise can be quite expensive. And I'm not sure that that's, that there's an answer out there as yet to how that will be funded and how it'll be packaged up, say, with some sort of industry strategy for getting those people onto the project with the appropriate skills.
Perhaps I could add to that. As an old technician, I find this quite fascinating that I did a lot of the theory. I went to TAFE and got the diploma, what we now call the Diploma of Engineering, and I have very good theoretical background. And so I've spoken to people and asked them, where would I fit in today's thing? I worked in overseas telecommunications in the old days, in exchange, very high-level technical work. The answer is it's too old, it's no good. These days, training seems to be tailorised a lot. That is, you're just trained on the specific things. There's no overall theoretical training which we received in the old days. And I wouldn't have a chance of being RPL'd into the situation. That would require me to do further training, perhaps on optical fibre and jointing. Of course, I've never done that. But a lot of the theory and that, apart from, I would be aware of, the practical part of doing it I wouldn't have. So how you convert that over is it really needs me to be just tailorised into various segments of what's needed by NBN.
I know your pain. When I do mechanical stuff, I lift a bonnet of a car and I'd be shot. I'd never be able to work on a car again, the new ones. Is an idea on cost to do a course for... I mean, I know what you're saying is it's very specific in what can be discussed with RPLs. Got an idea of costing of to run a course through a TAFE or, you know, a learning institution that might be able to do that?
You'd probably be talking thousands, I think, rather than hundreds.
Yep. Okay.
I mean, it depends again whether it's bundled up with, you know, some other bridging training as well.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, that's the problem. That the TAFEs want people on seats, and they want people on seats for Cert 2s and Cert 3s. They don't just want to have people come in the door, RPL them, and then sort of see them out. That's the difficulty. And basically, you know, that creates a bit of a disincentive for them to do it. And secondly, if they do it, they tend to charge like wounded bulls for it. So that's just a sort of practical problem of getting that RPLing done. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit different from Dan's situation, yours as you describe it, in that, I mean, the people we're talking about, for instance, in Telstra may need some bridging training to work on fibre, maybe not. Depends what they're going to be doing when they come out and, say, work on the rollout. But they do have competencies. They're competent workers in some areas of network build, but they don't necessarily have any formal certification or recognition of that. So they can do it. It's not that their skills are out of date or anything, it's just that they won't have the formal recognition that's part of what NBN Co quite reasonably is asking for as a sort of quality control over the workforce.
When they do leave Telstra, I've often seen they have a very long list of training courses they've done, but it's, as Ros said, that's that formal recognition that's missing. Having that recognised is important, obviously, to a person who's made redundant, but it's also important even if they stay in Telstra with the way the new scheme is to operate.
Okay.
Mike?
Thank you, Chair. Dan, I'd like to ask you in particular about the automatically eligible work group, and it's an issue I asked of Telstra up in this Sydney hearing, particularly the people that are in it and how they're in it, but also the people with skills that are not in it and have not been defined as yet. Has the union got any greater knowledge of that than Telstra were able to provide us at the time? Have they conversed with the union, or do you have information that says there are people beyond the 6,255 that could fit into that group?
We've had that discussion just before we came here. I'll just make a point. I have sought the deed, but I don't know. I think that must be commercially not available to us. So the terminology is a bit new, but in the practice, in the discussions we've had, yeah, we've talked about these things. Ros, you could elaborate on that.
You just indicated, sorry Chair if I can jump in, so you've indicated that they haven't shown you the RFD, but have they in effect taken the core components as they relate to the union and explained them? Have they walked you through those components in detail? Are you satisfied with the explanations or the interpretation of the deed as it applies?
Without having seen the deed, we can't say yes or no, but having read particularly the report from yesterday, and we've seen that now, I think the answer is yes, but I'll let Ros. Ros has been at the meeting, so...
Well, again, I mean, coming to the question of the eligible group, we've assumed, I suppose, that would encompass the large majority of the customer field workforce and a very substantial proportion of network design and construction, as it sort of is. And if you add those two groups of, those two sections of the workforce up, you know, you've got your 6,000 or so already. Then there may be people in the network side who, for instance, now sit and monitor faults on the copper network, who may presumably have a lot less of that work to do. In fact, they won't be monitoring a whole national network at all. And there are people nominated there, I see, by Telstra in the kind of wholesale area where it relates, in services and products and so on, where it relates to copper products, who will become potentially redundant as well. But the core of it is the customer field workforce, service delivery and the design construction functions. And, we're satisfied at this stage, I think, that that's going to be targeted, those people are going to be targeted for the actual retraining. So there may be some questions around the edges, but I don't think there's any question that the core of people who will be targeted by this funding are the people who need to be targeted.
So is it right to say that this would seem to be going to the top end, as in the people that have been or will be selected for this are those with higher levels of skills? What happens to workers at the semi-skilled end, for instance, so pit and pipe workers maybe? Is there any scope for them to fit into that in your view?
There are very few of them now in Telstra. Telstra's outsourced most of the civil works functions years ago. So, for instance, in the technical designations for the customer field workforce, I think there's no one in a CFW1. There'd be a handful of people who are CFW2s. I don't have the exact numbers, but, they're in the hundreds, certainly not the thousands. So that lower level work, by and large, has gone out of the company. There are people I know now working on remediation as part of the agreement with NBN Co. I think there are also, my understanding is that there are people being brought in as labour hire to do that work because in fact Telstra doesn't have a large workforce sitting there doing that kind of work anymore.
So is there a group of workers currently at Telstra that will miss out on access to the AEW, and if so, who would they be?
They may be older workers in the customer field workforce who...
So would they just be copper-based only at the moment?
There may be people, for instance, in the field workforce who are working now on copper for whom there is not necessarily a role when they move across into fibre because there's less of that kind of work with fibre. Apart from the kind of impacts of structural separation, there's also simply the question that maintenance of fibre requires fewer people.
Because it's newer and because it's less chance of breakdown.
Well, there are fewer, longer runs, fewer joints, more reliable. So what are they going to do? So you can retrain a certain proportion of the workforce to do the kind of work that Telstra is, in this early stage, as I understand it, starting to focus on. That is to get people who have some of those skills to do with wiring and lead-ins and so on, to get them to have a wider range of skills to use on the customer side of the network boundary. So those people go into the home and they put in the Telstra router, and while they're there they talk to the customer and explain why it is that the fridge isn't talking, to the TV, and offer to help. And that's a suite of skills which we think will provide ongoing work for Telstra employees into the future. But not everybody now working in the customer field workforce will necessarily feel comfortable with that kind of retraining. And that's one of the reasons we say, what's going to happen to those people who possibly may fall outside the retraining net, not through any kind of oversight of a deliberate kind, but because the opportunity to redeploy them into and to retrain them for useful ongoing work is limited, perhaps. And what happens to them? There may be work, nevertheless, for them still in various roles on the NBN construction side of things for a period of time. So, which is why that RPL component sort of becomes an issue.
Okay, my last question on this subject would then relate to people that might be eligible to do it but don't necessarily want to for various reasons. What's the feedback been like from the workforce to the union in that regard?
Mixed. I think there's some anxiety in some sections of the workforce about what it is they may be required to turn into. It's probably some age differences there. Probably some of the younger ones who are more, attuned to IP-based world, maybe are more willing to embrace it. But to be honest, we haven't had, because the whole training program is in a very early stage.
Yes. Well, you haven't even seen the deed.
No, and, my understanding from the last meeting we had that, we're talking about maybe 100 so people who've been retrained up to a point where they're actually going out and performing new functions. So it's a bit too early, really, for us to be getting any extensive feedback from our membership. You get, it's more like straws in the wind than any kind of real indication of how they're going to accept the possibilities of retraining and redeployment.
So
Whether they're going to
say
say
it's a little bit of unsurety. It's just not.
Yeah, there's a
not
lot of
knowing what's
there's
coming.
a lot of uncertainty in the workforce, obviously, about what the impacts of this are going to be.
Thank you.
Okay, Doug, have you got...
Yeah, just... I won't go there.
Thank you for you, Ed. Well, best one yet.
Can I just ask, just on the RFD, can I just give...
Is it dinner break or?
We'll hand over to Mark.
Yeah, yes, I'm back. Yeah. You see, you're like Pavlov's dog in this game. The bell rings and you go.
Well, if you're not salivating too much...
slip on your way through.
Yeah, can I just then ask... Let me find it. It says that Telstra have indicated that as part of its proposed training programme, it will consider combining RPL with new training where it is reasonably able to do so. Is that a statement of fact, or do you see this as a barrier, this reasonably able to do so? How is that working?
There's two lots of RPL involved here. One is the RPLing that we're saying that we would like to combine with the training, the retraining, to make sure that people have the best chance of coming up with a Cert 2 or a Cert 3 or a Cert 4. So to bring people up to a full qualification level as part of the internal training program. Some companies don't like a fixation on certification, but most employees like it. So even if they've got a guarantee for work for 4 years or 5 years or 10, to actually come out of this exercise with a Cert 4 or a Cert 3 would be, in our view, a good outcome. And that would be achieved by a mixture of retraining on the basis of, recognised training packages and possibly RPLing. But we've raised that twice now, I think, with Telstra, both in the first meeting that's reported here and in the most recent one. And again, they've said, yes, where it makes sense, where we're talking about maybe, a few units needed to bring somebody up to a full qual. But there's no ironclad guarantee.
So have you had discussions about the definition of reasonably able to do so?
We've tossed it backwards and forwards.
And what's your view?
Our view...
Can I just say, the reason I'm raising this, as a former union official, when I see these sort of qualifications on training, you go, well, that's just a barrier.
It is a barrier.
Am I being too hard on Telstra?
No, I think Telstra is saying we don't recognise that as necessarily part of our obligation under the trust deed. I think that's what they're saying. To RPL people as part of the retraining, to bring them up to a full qualification, I think...
I understand how they can't do that. Like, if you've got ICT levels that require a certain competency and you have to have trained up for that, surely you have to recognise prior learning to get to that qual. Like, are they not...
You may not have to get to a full qual, though. That's the point. You can have a whole range of competencies which just have one or two sort of missing, and therefore you won't have a full Cert 2 or a full Cert 3. And that's the issue. You might end up with a kind of patchwork of skill sets which just leave you short of a full qualification. Now, I'm not here to speak for Telstra, but their position has always been, like, we'll train people and where possible we'll bring them out at a full qualification level. But if that's not, you know, if that doesn't make sense for us, if it's just a group of skill sets and not a full qual, then that's it. Now, we think it makes, you know, sense in this context to combine the two things. And they are, I'll say this, they do appear to be doing some work now on aligning their internal training to the ICT 10 package. And you do that if you're sort of putting in place the preconditions for RPLing. So Telstra historically has done a whole lot of training which is not necessarily based on the approved industry training package and is not aligned to it. Now they're doing that work of alignment, and that will provide the practical basis for RPLing. They're also a registered RTO, so they can do it internally. So it's there, but getting the, you know, the preconditions are there, but getting the sort of ironclad commitment that, yes, we'll do that, as you can see, we have not got that in these discussions.
Can I jump in on that point? Just on that point, so Telstra has undertaken training that it believes is fit for purpose within Telstra.
Yes.
But this training fund is designed to train people or build in people's skills that will help them in an quote-unquote NBN world.
Yes.
What's being done by Telstra from what they've indicated to you to move from a model where they've focused primarily on their own need, which I understand they would have prior to all these changes that are undergoing or have been required to be undertaken, to this point now where under the RFD they provide a training plan and they're supposed to retrain people to a standard that would be broadly accepted in the industry?
Well, the training that they have to undertake under the RFD has to be aligned to registered training packages and to nationally recognised qualifications. So that's that.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, so that part of it, you know, is not problematic. But they may deliver training which is based on ICT 10, the relevant training package, you know, where the quality control as far as the, you know, actual delivery of it is perfectly acceptable, but that may not bring people out at a full qualification level, which is the issue that Senator Cameron's sort of investigating. To do that, you may have to RPL them, and even when you RPL them, they may not. You know, we've raised that with them because we think not only do we want people sort of trained against, of course, you know, national externally recognised qualifications, but we like the idea of people coming out with a full qualification. But
So I assume, excuse me, it's a skill-based career path for your members
yes,
at Telstra. So you're saying that people are being, this is my words, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, people are being stranded between skill levels. They're being trained up to some aspects, but not the whole aspect to give them a move to the next skill level, is that right?
they're trained up to job descriptions which align to AQF levels, but they've never been lockstep. So bear in mind that, you know, Telstra historically was the industry and did all of its industry training internally. It has never moved entirely to an internal training program based on the AQF system in any kind of mandatory or lockstep fashion. So our job descriptions reference the AQF, but they don't require you to have an AQF 4 before you can move up to another grade in the sort of skill hierarchy.
Thanks.
Just in terms of the automatically eligible work group, has Telstra walked you through how they actually establish that group themselves? Like, how do they identify someone to be classified or categorised within that group?
Not on an individual basis. We, at the very early meetings, and now I'm talking possibly 18 months ago, the discussion was about the sections of the workforce. So service delivery, network construction and subsequently, you know, there was some discussion about the wholesale products that were copper-based.
So have they given like a breakdown of the functions and the number of people estimated alongside those
They haven't
functions
given
that you just detailed?
a breakdown of the classifications. So we don't know, for instance, we have asked, and not, you'll see that in, I think, the first lot of correspondence also, we asked for a breakdown in terms of, you know, how many CFW3s, how many CFW4s are going to be retrained, that sort of question. And the response was, we're not thinking of it in those terms, we're thinking of it in terms of functional areas rather than in classification structures.
Okay. Do they have a process, is this more an estimating process by them as to who fits in the AEW based on likely functions, aligning them with what would be done or what would be outlined in the RFD? Or do they have a process of actually like identifying someone who might be surplus to requirement under a, like where they're no longer required to work on copper or HFC, and then put them in formally? How are they?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, but my understanding is it's the first process.
Okay.
So I don't think it's a one-by-one, you know, this person may be about to become, or this group of people here may be about to become, because after all, you know, that's not where we are with the actual process now. I mean, this is a forward-looking training program, in fact, to an extent, potentially. I mean, there's no one who's been displaced today that you could say, really, with certainty, was displaced because the NBN's rolled into town. So in that sense, it's anticipatory. And the anticipation is that people who now work on copper will, over, you know, the next 8 to 10 years, no longer be doing that. Now, what the current process seems to be, on the basis of the last discussion we had with them, is that the thinking is that the training and the redeployment of the workforce, or the creation of new functions, will follow the actual NBN rollout. So, for instance, the group of people who, I think the 100 that I mentioned before, who have been retrained to do a wider range of functions on the customer side of the network boundary, they're doing that obviously in areas where it is possible actually to migrate people onto, you know, the NBN, and they can receive active services. I mean, there's no work for them until the NBN's there and ready to provide active services
But
for that group.
Yeah, sure. With as much as the NBN hasn't necessarily rolled out to that extent that would make a lot of these positions redundant, they have anticipated some of this though. Like, would you agree that they've anticipated by some of the plans that they've put forward for offshoring, like some of the functions, the restructuring of the organisation, where they're offshoring work, in particular in the switch data network, where they were proposing to offshore people, and some of the coverage that was generated earlier in the year about their offshoring of 200 or so positions. I understand at the time they were suggesting that that was because, in anticipation of what was going to happen with NBN, that they wanted to move some of those functions. Is there any interrelationship that you can see, or?
Well, I got involved
If
in
it's
that.
not, it's not. Like, I'm just interested in knowing, you know.
Yeah, I was involved in that, and it's hard to work out why they were moving those jobs offshore. It was certainly industrially a major event for us, because our people had to train the people who they were going to replace, who were replacing them. The jobs were sent to India, and a number of people came out. They were either asked to train them one-on-one, or they have software. There's a special name for it, which doesn't come to my lips at the moment, but they have software where the people can sit remotely and see how the work's being done on the screens and learn from that. So that I was concerned that that wasn't the sort of training we were wanting, of training others. We would rather see those jobs, because they were highly skilled jobs.
Were those the type of functions that would be covered by that the people doing that work would be notionally designated within the automatically eligible workforce?
Well, from our discussions, we don't think so. I don't
Yes,
know.
I don't see how they would be necessarily. I mean, I think, to come to what you're suggesting, that Telstra is likely to take, when it suits them, a narrow view of what might be covered by the automatically eligible, workforce. But again, there's only so much room for movement around the edges of that. And there's still a large core of people who, without doubt, are quite properly the target group, about which there's no argument. So in the case of those network functions, was higher level sort of network diagnostics. I think, like a lot of functions at present, it's not all that much different in credit management, The lower level diagnostic or managerial or back of house functions in that case are being offshored and the higher level ones are being retained.
Okay. And any, in terms of any redundancies that have occurred between, so the actual agreement between NBN and Telstra was signed in March, or took effect from March. The RFD's been, or the training plan has been prepared since then, and I think it was due to be lodged with the department in late April. Any redundancies that have occurred in that time, how have Telstra dealt with them? Have they categorised those as, normal sort of business as usual redundancies, or have they sought to actually retrain people that might be made redundant in the next few months?
They're, as always, saying formally that they will consider redeployment. But in practice, I think most of the redundancies which have been flagged for consultation between April and now have probably taken place. A lot of them have not been in our, well, some of them are in our areas, some aren't. Like the large swag that came from the credit management area. We probably only have a sort of small number of members in that area of the 200 odd who were targeted. And again, in that case, I don't think we know whether there's been any successful redeployment.
No.
But again, I don't know that they'd be easily argued to be part of the eligible group in relation to the sort of copper to fibre transition. I will say that of late, Telstra has been signalling to us because we're in EA discussions now, that they want a great deal more emphasis on redeployment, partly in order to comply with the trust deed, which they are kind of sharply aware of.
Because what's been the nature previously where people have been identified for a redundancy? Has it been easy to redeploy people within Telstra in the past? I mean, I'm using easy as a word loosely, but just to sort of get a sense of...
No.
I'd say no. I'm told anecdotally that the redeployment is improving, but in the past, no, most people had gone.
So have you put that to Telstra, that situation at Telstra, and asked them what would be different between then and now?
Not in those specific terms, but...
Telstra is aware of the redeployment sort of requirements under the trust deed, and that's going to affect a very large swag, but not the majority necessarily of their staff.
And has Telstra said to you words to the effect of every person in the AEW who is a beneficiary of retraining will get a job within Telstra?
No.
Right. What has that been asked of them? Or?
Not in those terms, but it's obviously the expectation, and it has been discussed broadly, that if Telstra is going to spend money retraining people, we assume that they're going to use them.
Yep.
They don't spend the money to retrain them to push them out the door to work for their commercial rivals, presuming that they're skilled up in things that are of commercial use to the company.
But if they're using the $100 million that's being extended to them by the government, you'd want to know...
Yes. Well, the assumption would be, this has been discussed, Like, it's not quite the same as having something written in writing that says, you know, anyone who's retrained will never be kind of made redundant. But first of all, it's the expectation in the terms of the trust deed that are public, that is what it's for, to stop them being made redundant. Secondly, if you spend the money, even, you know, whether it's a mixture of Telstra money and government money, you're still expecting, presumably, to use those skills internally. So, you know...
I think we're going from the presumption that they don't want to train anybody who they can't find work for.
Okay.
Yeah, that they can't use.
I've got more questions, but I'm happy to defer if there are
I'm
other.
conscious of time. Are you happy to have them on notice? Is there any that you want to get out now?
There is one, just one quick question. In the correspondence that you submitted to us from Julian Clark, Director of Workplace Relations and Policy, dated, it's in an email sent in late April from Julian Clark to Dan Dwyer, under the subheading Relationship between Competency Clusters, Curriculum and Functional Roles, the last sentence of their response says, the capabilities and skill levels required of technical customer service workforces in an NBN world, as well as the distribution of those capabilities, is yet to be fully understood. I don't understand how you could make that statement from a corporation of that size. Can you explain what from your perspective, how you understand that statement to be?
I think they're saying, if I may respond, well, I think they're perhaps being a bit disingenuous. But I think what's being said is we still don't quite know what the exact profile will be of telecommunications service industry workers in the future, and just what the skill mix will be, which will be of use to the company and to any other companies. Okay. So we're starting to see emerge, not only in Telstra in their thinking, if I just very briefly finish, but also Optus and others are starting to develop workforces either internally or through labour hire, who have that kind of mix of skills that we were describing before. That is, they can do a range of functions inside the house. They've got IP integration type skills, perhaps combined with cabling skills, and indeed sort of customer, someone who can actually teach the customer. Yeah. So they've got customer relationship skills. And that's a new sort of person in a way. And exactly what that person looks like and what training you need to create them is not yet completely fixed. Yep. So I think that's the kind of... But, there's probably sitting underneath that a kind of industrial relations issue saying, we're not yet ready to pay that person an extra kind of 50% on top of what our people are earning now.
Okay. And finally, just to get a sense, just to cover this off, what is your sense in terms of the nature of the consultations? Are the consultations with you, there are two types. It's either ticker box consultation, they've done it and they can say that they've gone through the process, or do you feel that this is an engaged process where the views are sought, where issues that are raised by the union are taken on board and responded to thoroughly? How would you categorise the nature of the consultations with Telstra to date?
Well, I'd say it probably sits somewhere slightly in between. It's more than ticker box, because Telstra is sharply aware of the fact that committees such as this, that the government, the department, everybody's legal team probably is looking at it and looking at the implementation process. So they're very conscious of that, and my sense of it is that all the way down the company, in the different layers that we're involved with, that is a sharp awareness and that is creating a sort of willingness to engage. Okay. But as you see here, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything we suggest or ask for is handed over or complied with.
Yeah, I'm just surprised the RFD hasn't been made available in some shape or form.
We can pursue that.
Yep.
All right, thank you for coming today to assist the committee. I don't think there have been any requests for additional information. There may be some questions on notice, and if you could get those back to us as quick as possible if they do arrive through the Secretariat. And I thank you very much for giving evidence today and appreciate you coming in.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee.
Thank you.
If I could now call up the Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy. So if you've got any questions.
I was just interested to see a couple of red balls. There's the other thing too, that it is interesting, the premise that you're not going to retrain someone unless you move them along, but have the roles to identify, and if they can't, what's the relationship between Telstra and NBN Co in terms of maybe potentially shifting them over to work in NBN Co?
Double handling.
Yeah. Well, you know, there might be, because they're going to need those, some of those type of people.
Yeah. Okay, I now welcome the witnesses to the committee and thank you once again for coming in. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Peter Harris, Secretary, Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy.
Daryl Quinlivan, Deputy Secretary.
And I'm Ian Robinson. I'm the First Assistant Secretary of Telecommunications Division.
Jo Granger, Assistant Secretary.
Okay, and I had on my list that Mr. Mark Hazlett was coming as well, but not coming.
Oh, there you go.
We've got an improvement.
They've shortchanged your chair, we're sorry.
All right, well, that's on the record for you to sort out with him later. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Would you like to make an opening statement or table one in the interest of time, either way?
No, we won't be making an opening statement, Chair.
Okay. We have received a submission, but I might go around the table for questions. Ed, do you want to, because you were last time? As it should be last, should be first.
Yeah, that's fine. In terms of Telstra has submitted its draft training plan, is that correct?
Yep, Darryl, do you want to?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And has the department had discussions with Telstra and walked through effectively what Telstra's proposing?
Yes, we have. Yes.
And how would you categorise those discussions?
Very, very positive, and I think a decision on its acceptance is not too far away.
So, are you in a position where you can give some comment about what your overall views or particular elements, like if we ask in detail what you think of the plan, are you at liberty to be able to inform the committee what you think at this stage?
I think it's probably premature to do that until the Minister's made a decision on acceptance of the plan.
Well, that makes it hard.
But I think
we can do our best if you want to ask.
We have been discussing
under a
it.
marginal constraint.
We have been discussing it with the company and some other stakeholders, and Ms Granger might want to elaborate on this, and I think there's a generally pretty positive feeling about the contents of the plan and its quality.
But if I ask you to detail elements of it, can you do so?
No, I don't think that would be appropriate just yet.
Like I said.
Okay. That's it?
That's it.
What?
Can't go there. We need more information.
No.
Yeah.
You know what? Can I just try something else?
Sure.
Good luck.
You heard some of the comments earlier about the actual application of spend in terms of they've identified a workforce, they've indicated that there'd obviously be retraining requirements. What's the expectation in terms of, are you anticipating, well I can actually ask this, taking on board what you've said earlier, are you expecting that any person that is the beneficiary of that 100, or part of the 100 million that's been extended to Telstra, that there will be work for those people at the completion of the retraining within Telstra?
Well, I think that's very much the objective that Telstra has, and in fact that's the rationale underlying the arrangement generally, because you might recall the origins of this were part of the broader agreement with Telstra on the definitive agreements with NBN Co. This was an ancillary agreement, and the underlying logic was that payment to Telstra to retrain staff and avoid redundancies created a lot more value for Telstra than the value of the payment, and so there was a win for both parties in the transaction that contributed to the value Telstra was realising from the definitive agreements generally. So I think it's very much Telstra's objective that they retain these people within the company and therefore avoid the redundancies, and that's how the value is created for the company.
So have they, and again, I understand it's difficult for you to provide detail, but they have a list of categories or functions that would attract the scope of the AEW. Have they said, this is what we identify now, the people that require retraining, and these are the type of roles we think they can perform once they've gone through retraining? Have they outlined, I don't need the detail, but have they, at a later point we would like that, but have they identified that to you?
Well, they've certainly identified the categories of employees that will be eligible, and those are the skill groups that they're seeing as being part of the future labour needs of the company. Ms. Granger might want to add to this because she's been involved in the discussions, but I think they're very much proposing to continue to employ people in those skill areas.
Indeed. So, Mr Husick, at this stage, Telstra hasn't necessarily put out a list of job descriptions of future roles, but they certainly have identified the skills gaps they'll need and the kind of work and areas that they'll need people to do that, and therefore they're planning their training on that basis, and that has been included in the training plan.
Okay. Doesn't look like anyone else. I've just got a question in regards to the submission you kindly made on the private equity issue, and the key point at your end seems to be that you don't even think anyone will turn up unless there's a rate of return between 15 to 25%, as well as the adapting and learning process of the department and NBN Co.
It's a commercially driven decision in those circumstances.
Well, can I just finish? Because I'm just interested, A, that is correct, that they're the two, at the department and government end, it's adapting and learning. Commercial decision is rate of return's not even in the ballpark, so why bother? Second question on the back of that is the hypothetical one of if someone did turn up with a rate of return that was attractive, how much of this is an adapting and learning exercise that is driving this process compared to the commercial realities and rates of return? Just if you can just outline for me, where the balance is in that equation.
Sure. In the adapting and learning category, I guess what we put down is the government has clearly a policy objective in mind with the NBN, and it's got a detailed set of instructions to the company through the statement of expectations and a series of policy decisions. And the Parliament's got a set of instructions for the company with legislation. If a private investor convinced itself that it was prepared to take the risk and accept what is impliedly a low rate of return for long-term strategic gain purposes and did want to make an investment, then the company first and the government as 100% owner second would both need to satisfy themselves that this owner wouldn't get in the way of, if you like, the statement of expectations and Parliament's own intentions as expressed in legislation. And historically, being a minority investor is not a comfortable place for private equity in these sort of firms, because effectively they're passively stumping up capital, taking the risks, but they're not able to influence at all the direction of strategic change. And so it tends to be that private equity is not terribly comfortable taking those sorts of positions, which is why we think it's pretty unlikely in the circumstances that anyone would take the risk, and even if they did, they'd then have to satisfy themselves that they're prepared to follow the directions of the government of the day.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess I'm just seeing if you're willing to go on the record that it's less about rates of return. Even if someone stumped up at the right price to government and was willing to play that role for whatever reasons, there would still be a level of discomfort because it's that flexibility and that learning and adapting that is really what's driving this period of a large spend with taxpayers' dollars through the initial phase of risk.
I would go on the record saying that would be my advice to government. That would be my advice. Be very wary of this, even if they've convinced themselves that the rate of return is, the risk is sufficient for them to take it up. You then have to satisfy yourself, and I'd say the risk to the project is significant in those circumstances that you end up with an uncomfortable partner, and that's not a great outcome for either party to set up.
Right.
So I think that's really what we were trying to provide an answer. It wasn't an answer designed to be uncooperative.
No. I'm just trying to clarify.
I might also comment. I think people, though, there is possibly a gathering view that there's a proxy for this investment, and that is Telstra itself. Because to the extent to which the government is effectively turning previously non-earning assets like ductor space into valuable assets for Telstra, I think the market is recognising, and you've seen the movement in the Telstra share price, and although it's very hard to disentangle what relates to the NBN versus what relates to any other decisions that Telstra management has taken, and it's taken quite a few, the mobile phone market, for example, nevertheless, I think those who are seeking to invest in the prospectivity, if you like, of this project would probably see the benefit that can come from an investment in Telstra, which is effectively, a participant, a very active and highly relevant participant to the delivery of the NBN project. And so I think there's some beneficial flow, I'm sure, there. How much of the market shift in Telstra's price related to that and how much is related to other factors, I couldn't disentangle, but I do think you will see it reflected there. But I doubt, because of the practical circumstances I've just described, that we'd like to see much private equity interest in the NBN Co as a business through the bulk of the rollout period, simply because of that risk.
Sure, but as was stated before, because a counter argument to that would be that business could trust government's modelling, and this is a 40-year asset with a long-term financial return of significance, and therefore be willing to take on the risk at some particular point, and potentially earlier than we all, might have thought, because this is a long-range option. But that's why I wanted to get you on the record before, is even if someone did turn up with that intent in mind of making a long-term play, there would still be a discomfort from the department and from government and potentially from NBN Co.
I think from NBN Co, yes.
Based on
just
the issues around learning.
The partnership.
But when I use and before you get to that, Chair, before you get to the adaptive and learning, adaptation and learning, the government would want to be satisfied that it wasn't risking any basic policy compromises through this relationship, such as uniform pricing and the rollout priorities and so on. So there's a whole lot of quite fundamental points you'd want to be reassured on before you even got to that point. I think.
Sure, but if a business of significance turned up, accepted the business modelling that government has done on itself, then it was willing to go through that path, there would still be a wall that would be hit for reasons other than rate of return.
That's right. That's right.
And that's what I'm trying to get on the record to establish.
When I used the term risk a little earlier, I wasn't referring to people's views about the efficacy or otherwise of the business planning. That's certainly there, but it's just one of a number of things that a firm like that would have to satisfy itself on, and I don't think that's by any means the biggest of them. I think the business planning done by NBN Co stands up pretty well. It's not that. When I say risk, it's this what I call partnership risk, I guess, as I'll describe it. That you'd have to convince yourself as an investor that you are prepared to go along with the senior partner's decisions continuously.
Sure, But
And that's a hard thing to do.
I'm now wondering whether that has been ruled out before it's even been tested, because that is the nature of private-public partnerships everywhere, rightly or wrongly, that there is a partnership model on capital spend, sharing risk for shared return.
Yep.
So
I've worked on some of those PPPs in the past.
yeah,
And I know
some
the
go
nature
well,
of
some
them.
go terribly.
Yeah, no, but it's not even that. It's more a question of both parties being confident they're prepared to hold hands, as it were, through a period of multiple years of, I guess I have to use the term, risk-taking together.
Right.
And that's quite difficult to crystallise. It's quite difficult to crystallise because, as you know, the engagement will switch very quickly from being conceptual to being legal. And then you start to draw up the obligations that each party has, and because the NBN Co is structured under legislation, it will have very little room to move. In practice, the ownership structures for NBN Co, as you know, have been established by the Parliament, and therefore we live obviously within those terms, as well as the statement of expectations and intentions of the ministers.
And you think they're the fundamental points that make this different from other PPPs you've worked on? Or,
That's right, I
you know,
do. Because most
the
of
initial
those are,
rules of engagement.
most of those are project-based, and we can therefore vary the terms of a tender or a contract to suit the interests of both parties, if both parties are happy. Whereas legislation, as you know, we have to return to the Parliament. People have to be satisfied in the Parliament that these changes are acceptable. It's a long and drawn-out process, and one that tends not to be consistent with commercial timeframes. So most PPPs, the effective ones that I've been in, and I'm actually probably on balance a supporter of PPPs. I know they have weaknesses, but on balance I'm a supporter of them, used in the right circumstances, and legislation tends not to be part of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Look, unless there's any other...
Well, I just suppose on PPPs, I'm not a great supporter of some PPPs over a long period of time because the risk seems to come back to government anyway. And I suppose if there was an agreement made on a standard PPP type approach, the government would end up carrying the risk anyway. So what would be the benefit of this?
I think it's not an unreasonable position you put forward, Senator, but industry, commercial industry at the moment would probably say the balance of risk in the nature of the bigger projects has been more carried by them than by government, and that is true. You've seen PPPs where they've gone into receivership, the costs have been borne therefore by equity, and government's ended up with an asset for the community and shareholders have lost money. And in others, you've seen, I guess, unanticipated risks crystallised where I think in the public sector, and certainly I'd say this in the contracts I've been involved in, we've been pretty solid on behalf of the public sector in ensuring we don't carry any extra risk, but that creates great tension then when effectively your partner is losing money as they're meant to be building and delivering this final piece of infrastructure. So that's what I think they would say, but I don't disagree with you. Infrastructure Australia, I think, and Infrastructure New South Wales are both having a look at this idea of a standard PPP form, and I think that's one of the sorts of things, the comments you've made, are the sorts of things that they would probably want to take into account. The standard PPP form could and should be closely considered by government for where the ultimate balance of risk does lie.
Is there any recognition within the department that this is already a PPP of sorts with a twist? From an end user point of view,
You're referring obviously to the
it's
relationship
wholesale and
with Telstra.
retail, and everyone needs. There are people who need to make a profit all the way through the chain to deliver a product.
Yep.
More of a double take.
Right. Well, if there are too many impediments put in the way between wholesale and retail, then consumer loses, government loses.
That's right.
So
And
it is a variation on the theme.
The special access undertaking that NBN Co is currently developing with the ACCC and the industry's interest in that probably represent the primary field where that's being discussed at the moment. Clearly the industry is keen to ensure that it doesn't bear any more of, this is in non-price terms, people have focused on price and commentary on the SAU I think, but the non-price issues I think are the bigger suite of issues from the industry's perspective, as I understand it, and from NBN Co's perspective as well. And those involve sharing of risks. Obviously, the risk that says, you're my wholesaler, you're guaranteeing a service to this customer, but I'm the retailer, I'm the person that the customer is interfacing with, and if the product isn't being delivered in the form that the customer is happy with, I'm bearing some of your liability. And those sorts of working arrangements are the things that NBN Co is currently putting quite a lot of effort into trying to settle with industry. And I think you'll see that play out through the course of the rest of this year in the context of developing the SAU.
All right, look, thanks for that. Nothing else that we need to know at this stage on...
I owed you a document from previous meetings, which I haven't written to you on, and I noticed the committee has expressed some views on answers to questions and things like that. So I thought I would just come along and say at the latter part, I think, of the last hearings, I did say to you I would assist in pointing out where the funding for NBN Co comes from in the budget papers. And I just would like to note I did write to you in May as chair of this committee, as well as to the chair of the Estimates Committee, Senator, and point out where the funding is. But I did it in a funny way. We'd actually made an error in our PBS, and so it's an error correction document, but it achieves the same outcome. So it actually included the tables from the budget statements where the funding for NBN Co is located. I thought I would.
Okay, did you want to table that, or we've already got it?
I can do it again. Yes, I have a copy here, and I'll happily.
We've already got it, so.
Yeah, that's right. But I just thought I would eliminate one question that we didn't provide you a written answer on. It was primarily because, well, I thought we'd done it, but then I thought maybe I'd better just make sure it's clear.
Yeah, that's fine. All right. Any other issues while we're on the record that are floating around? Do you want to correct anything in the public domain?
Probably we should point out that...
did you love our third report?
Ian Robinson has joined us. Ian's brand new in this role, and that's in part because we have restructured. I think I told the other committee, the Estimates Committee, we've restructured the nature of the department because a lot of our development, policy development and legislation development role has now almost finalised. The SAU is probably the remaining big residual piece of that activity. And so we've restructured the department, reduced the amount of resourcing going to that NBN development phase because it's basically over. And Pip Spence, who I think you might remember, Chair, she's gone off to a job in Prime Minister's Department as head of the Cabinet Office, and Ian is her replacement. So you'll be seeing Ian rather than Pip from now on.
Okay. Any news on updated corporate plan?
Corporate plan, the government is considering the corporate plan at the moment. There will be probably a bit of need for feedback between us and NBN Co before the government is able to finalise that and put it in front of the committee for its consideration and that sort of thing. But yeah, nowhere NBN Co has met its deadlines in submitting it to government.
All right. Okay, look, thank you for that. Thanks for coming in for an evening meeting and assisting the committee. I don't think there are any additional issues at this stage. If some do come in from members who aren't here, if you could get them back to us through the Secretariat as quick as possible, I think that'd be appreciated.
I think through the Secretariat we have organised quite a good, what I call informal answering process at the moment. So although our formal answering processes obviously haven't satisfied the committee as much as you'd like, I think the informals are available at any point in time. So if you've got questions, please ask us and we'll get answers back to you that can be circulated.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it before I close the meeting, is it the wish of the committee to authorise for publication, including publication of the parliamentary database, the proof of the transcript of evidence given before it at the public hearing today? Thanks, Doug. I'd like to thank colleagues and all witnesses for their time today and declare the public hearing closed. Thanks a lot for coming in again.